So we've been on the kind of like the same thought process journey for the last 3 or 4 weeks, whereas Paul has been beaten, arrested, threatened to be killed, and now he's been moved down to say, I can't talk it. It's not Caesar, but it's Caesarea, I think is how you say it, maybe? We're going to go with that. Anyway, so he's down there, and at this point, they've said, hey, you're going to be held here until your accusers come down, so he gets a fair trial. And that's really the gist of what's going on. He's been accused of things that are not accurate, and he's been able to communicate to the Romans, he's been able to communicate to the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the people that follow Jesus in a way that he's able to kind of diffuse all their arguments, and so they had no other option except for just to shut him up by killing him, because they could not prove him wrong when they spoke. And so they became angry, they want to kill him. There was an attempt or a plot to kill his life, or kill him, excuse me, so they took him, and he is now with this guy named Felix, who we're getting ready to talk about. And that's where we pick up Acts 24. We're going to read it in just a second. I think it's interesting, I read this day, we'll talk about it, but Paul had a lot of patience. Like, he just did. Like, the dude's been taken here, taken there. We talked about this at the end of last week some, but he really did. He had a lot of patience. He was able to withstand a lot. And we really don't read over time when he really whined about it. He just kind of took it on the chin and kept on ticking. And that's tough. That's tough to do. Whether you're in ministry, whether you're a saint, whether we all get things that happen in our life that are frustrating. I was telling Aaron today, I said, man, got out my little blower, I'm blowing my laptop and fixing, cleaning my phone, and now my phone's broke. And I was like, what? Seriously? I was doing the right thing and cleaning things. Okay, great. Didn't use water, don't know what happened, hopefully it fixes. But it's those things happen no matter what. And it's you have a choice to get frustrated, and I was just whatever. If I use AirPods, I can answer my phone until I figure this out. We'll move on. But Paul obviously had things that really happened to him. I mean, he's been beaten and accused and lied upon, and that's not fun. When somebody, it's bad enough when somebody brings out something you did that you really did wrong, and you have to face a crowd of people and say, yeah, that was me, I made a mistake. Imagine being falsely accused over and over and over again, and your name being absolutely dragged through the mud. That's where Paul's at. And if we're just being real here, that's where Paul's been at. He's been absolutely bombarded with false accusations. We go back 5 or 6 chapters, we know the women rose up against them and were trying to cause problems. And then now we see this group and this group, and it tends to see in this storyline we've been talking, it's a group of people from Asia that have they literally hate him so much they have followed him just to persecute him. I want to know what they did for a living because they can afford just to give up everything in town. That's what they did, and we're going to talk about that. But this group of people has been the instigator behind every problem that he's had. They show up, start whispering in crowds, riots arise, and this is what we've read chapter over chapter over chapter over chapter. And now Paul's moved, and they're you have to wait till everybody comes down. Man, that's rough. He's I get taken away at night. Granted, it was a bunch of army men that take him. That's awesome, but still, I'm still in prison. Right. And now I'm sitting here in a higher Roman court, and I have no idea when this is going to happen. I mean, they could take 6 days, they could take 10 days, 2 years. We don't know at this point. You can't leave till they come and make their accusation. Great, I have to sit here and wait for them to lie on me. Thanks, dude. This is where Paul's at, really where he's at. And I don't know why, but I feel that's important for us to understand his mindset right now. Because then when he communicates, we're whoa, you're able to speak like that and not I'd be throwing baseball bats at people at this point. If I could just be real, I'd be mad. Now you've lied about me enough, and he doesn't do that. So that's where we pick up 24. If somebody wants to read 24, 1 through, we'll go through 1 through 8.
And after 5 days, the high priest, Ananias, came down with some elders and a spokesman, one Tertullus.
All right, pause for a second. So Tertullus is actually an attorney. So they hired an attorney to prosecute Paul because they were speaking before and their words didn't do enough. So now they've hired a heavy gun to come in and take care of Paul.
I did not know They laid before the governor their case against Paul. And when he had been summoned, Tertullius, the lawyer, began to accuse him, saying, Since through you we enjoy much peace, and since by your foresight, most excellent Felix, reforms are being made for this nation, in every way and everywhere we accept this with all gratitude. But, to detain you no further, I beg you in your kindness to hear us briefly. For we have found this man a plague, one who stirs up riots among all the Jews throughout the world, and is a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes. He even tried to profane the temple, but we seized him. By examining him yourself, you will be able to find out from him about everything of which we accuse him.
So if you read this, it reads like a lawyer. Like if you really think about it, it does. So I find this funny. This dude's accusing Paul. He's, at this point, we don't even know if he's ever really met him. He's been hired. He's literally been a thug that's been hired. That was the reason. What I can understand why he was respected in the courts. So they're like, oh, let's go get somebody. It'd be kind of like, when I was younger, my brother had some legality issues, whatever. We hired an attorney, and it was dumb, and we knew if we didn't take care of it, it was going to be bad. My brother was like 16. We hired an attorney, and he walked in, and he goes to the judge, "Yo, we going golfing this weekend?" That's how the conversation started. It's the best $30,000 my parents ever spent, because they knew what was being said about my brother was false. But if he was found guilty, it was going to be very bad. And so we hired an attorney, and the attorney's like, I know the judge, we're good. We're like, okay, cool. Oh no, he knew the judge. And the judge was like, what do you recommend? He's like, how about this? The guy's like, go get the prosecutor to approve it, I'll do whatever you want. Walked out, got it signed off, came back in. We were fighting for a long time. But once you have somebody, so that's what they did here. They hired somebody they thought, when he speaks, they'll listen. This dude's like slimy when he opens his mouth. Like the first thing he says is, since through you we enjoy much peace. He's lying. Study out who Felix was, not the case at all. That dude was not peaceful at all. But he's like trying to just use words to schmooze them and make them feel boastful. And so he's like talking about most excellent Felix. Reforms are made for this nation. I mean, you can just feel the dude's just word vomiting because he wants to get this guy Felix to see. And then he calls them the sect of the Nazarenes. That's like kind of like O.J. Simpson's defense. If the glove don't fit, you must acquit. That's what he was trying to find a catchphrase here. Like there was no sect of Nazarenes as far as anything I could tell. It was something he made up because Jesus was from Nazareth, and so he was attaching all the disciples to the Nazarenes. This was not a real thing. He was using it to kind of create a stir, so that way this Felix would be like, oh, this guy's part of a group or a riot, because remember, riots were illegal. We read this in Acts 19. We read that how riots were illegal, and the Romans did not play with ruckuses. They did not like them. You're good. And so he was trying to attach him to a group. It would be like trying to call a bunch of guys who rode motorcycles together, and they said, because they did something, the cops like, oh, that's a biker gang. No, we just ride together. It's the same concept. He is trying to get them connected because that gives more power, because again, the Romans wanted order in things. And of course, then he goes and says, and he's the ringleader. Right. So he's like, we've got the big dog. We've got him caught, locked down. We've got the head of the crime family of the sect of Nazarenes. And then he's like, he even tried to profane the temple. Felix could care less about the temple because that's not his thing. What he cared about was, well, if he's messing with the temple, I'm going to have to deal with a whole bunch of people that are angry. And that's where they were trying to explain to him and get him to understand that this was causing problems for them as Jewish people, and he wanted him to handle it on the Roman side of it because they couldn't handle it in their own courts. And then, of course, he's like, by examining him yourself, you're going to be able to find out everything about him which we accuse him. I find this funny again because we see the high priest did come down. I didn't say that, so I apologize. The high priest came down with some elders and a spokesman. So they brought this attorney. And so they come forward. But we don't see any evidence. Like, it never tells us they brought evidence. It's really all hearsay. And we're going to get into that in a minute. But so just imagine Paul sitting there, and maybe he's expecting to see this high priest, and maybe he's ready. You ever been in that situation? I have. Like, I know I have a meeting with somebody. I'm like, oh, I know how you're going to come at me. I'm prepared, right? Like, I'm ready. You're going to say this, and we're going to go here. And Paul walks out, and he's like, oh. And maybe this guy was well known. From what I could gather, he was pretty popular attorney or spokesperson. So maybe Paul knew him being connected, and he's like, oh Lord, help me. This just got more serious because now they have a spokesperson, and they're ready to come at him. And you know, one thing I pulled out of this I thought was interesting is you have to be careful. People can speak some really pretty words, and they sound great, but they are hollow, like an Easter bunny. Chocolate nothing inside. It looks great on the outside, and then you pop it open, there's nothing inside. And that's what he's doing. He's just waxing words. He's just using these words to catch the ear of Felix. Nothing he has said here is any proof. There's really not even an accusation except for, well, he tried to profane the temple and he's creating riots. Well, that's really vague because there's not a lot of information there. And so he's really just trying to use words to convince and sway Felix to hear his side and just say, yeah, this dude's guilty. You sound good. You look good. And wow, they must know what they're talking about. The high priest brought a spokesperson. And if you can kind of just imagine what this all looked like, it was a circus. And that's exactly what it was.
I had no idea Tertullus was a lawyer and that they had hired him. I never made that connection.
Yeah, so what it says is, I'll give it to you. It says, it was the the orator who represented the Jewish plaintiffs in their accusations against Paul. They didn't have attorneys as understood today, so they would call them orators. Orators, right? Yeah, orators, I'm saying that. And so that's what he would have been. He would have been specialized training in rhetoric and familiar with the Roman system of law. And it would be helpful to help his clients in presenting their case against Paul. So I want to rephrase that. He would be what we call an attorney today, but they would have called him an orator. Why am I saying that wrong? O-A-O-R-A-T-O-R.
Orator.
We got it.
Okay, so that's what he would have been trained in Roman law and in rhetoric, which would have been, so he understood the Jewish law and the Roman law, a lot like Paul. So he could speak to both sides and he could make a connection so he could make their case stand that way.
Interesting.
Anybody else have, there's a lot in that little bit of 8 verses there. Anybody have anything to add?
Yeah, this a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes. Can any good thing come out of Nazareth? So Nazareth was known as like, that'd be like, say, well, like back in the 90s saying, yeah, this guy's from, like Compton or something.
So it was considered like I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but I thought Nazareth was considered almost like the slums, like almost like
Yeah.
it was a lower, so to say that,
Yeah.
to your point, so he was saying, not only is he a ringleader, but he's a ringleader of lower class, or he was trying to tie it back, and also tie it back to that Jesus was from Nazareth. Absolutely. Yeah, do you have anything to throw in? Do we want to turn the lights on before we get too far into it? I don't know why we keep, because it's light when we first start. Okay. So if we want to read, I'm just going to read 9 and then we'll go on, because 9 just is, it's like a blip between the two. It says the Jews also joined in charging, affirming that all these things were so. So this guy starts talking and the Jews again do what they all do, not all the Jews, but this group of Jews do. They just start kind of crowd mentality. Yeah, he's right, yeah. And they join in affirming the accusations that he's made, that he's the ringleader, riots, tried taking over the temple. Those are the three accusations that have been made. So that if we can read 10 through it's all tied together. Let's read 10 through 13, and then we'll just go from there. Or 10 through 14, excuse me.
And Paul, after that the governor had beckoned unto him to speak, answered, Forasmuch as I know that thou hast been for many years a judge unto this nation, I do the more cheerfully answer for myself, because that thou mayest understand that there are yet but 12 days since I went up to Jerusalem to worship. And they neither found me in the temple disputing with any man, neither rising up the people, neither in the synagogues nor in the city. Neither can they prove the things whereof they now accuse me. Did you say 13 or 15?
14, I'm sorry.
But this I confess unto thee, that after the way which they call heresy. So worship I the God of my Father, believing all things which are written in the law and in the prophets.
So in the ESV it says, it's just a different translation. It just, for me, I think it lays it down. He said, and when the governor had nodded to him to speak, so Felix kind of looks over at Paul and he's like, go ahead. Paul replied, and I think it's great. He doesn't start like, great, and he just
Really,
says,
Felix?
right, he's like, look, you have been a judge for many years. I happily make my defense. You know, he's like, he's not trying to tell him you're the greatest. He's like, listen, I understand you've been a judge, so you know what's going on. You have some understanding. So I will cheerfully make my defense to you. And he goes back, and remember we talked about this a few chapters ago, that when Paul went to the temple, he purified himself. And we were talking about why he did that. Well, we understand now the importance of, if he had not done that, there was a charge that could stick. Because he's saying, I didn't go, I did what I did what I was supposed to do. I didn't stir up any crowd in the temple or in the synagogue or in the city. So again, Paul's really smart, because he doesn't just say, I didn't stir up anything in the temple. He says, hold up, I didn't do it in the, it sounds like cat in the hat. I didn't do it there, not anywhere. He's like, look, I didn't do it in the crowd, I didn't do it in the temple, synagogue, or the city, bro. Like, I didn't mess with nobody, nowhere. He's like, hey, that's not me. But but think about it, because he could have just said, hey, he was so specific in what he said. He's like, okay, I know they're going to say here, and then what he did is he shut them down. And sometimes we have to be, when you respond or when you're saying things, being methodical about how you think, and I am not good at this on the spot. I'm much rather in text. I'm like, listen, send me a text, and then I have time, and if you've ever texted me about a hard conversation, you'll see the button like this for a really long time, because I'll type it. And if it's really hard, I have people that I trust in my life, that I will send it to them and say, this is what I'm trying to express. Am I expressing this? Because words are so powerful. And so if he would have said, I didn't do this in the temple, and he's like, yeah, but you had riots in the crowd, who's to say Felix was going to allow him to rebuttal again? So he was very methodical in how he said. He said, look, I didn't do it there, not in the temple, or in the synagogue, or in the city. He's like, not in the Jewish, not in the Gentiles. He's like, that's not me, dude. I didn't do it nowhere. I didn't cause any ruckus. And then he says, and they can't prove to you anything. And again, this is kind of Paul's way of like, they just made all their accusations. Where's the proof? There's nothing there. And then he does confess. So this is, again, I think this is, again, we see the wisdom and the anointing on Paul, because if he would have just left it there, he doesn't address the Nazarite sect, right? What they were trying to say. He's like, listen, I, according to the way. So he corrects them without correcting. He's like, we're not the Nazarite sect. He goes, we're the way. We follow the way, the truth, and the light. That's what they called the church, was the way.
Right.
And so he says, which they call a sect. He's like, we're not the sect, we're a way. He clarifies that. He's like, I worship the God of our fathers, believing everything laid down by the law and written in the prophets. So he again, masterfully is able to, in just a few short words, debunk everything that was said, defend himself without sounding like he's defending himself. If you've ever been in a position like this where you're falsely accused, man, it's tough. You want to come out swinging, or at least I do. Fight or flight mentality, I've got to fight. That's how God made me. I do not run and hide. I come out. Like, you gotta, okay, let's go talk about this. That's my mentality. And you have to be really careful. And so Paul does a great way of, it's non-combative. He does not attack the other people, because that's what we do, right? When we're attacked, we want to attack back. Paul doesn't attack them. We can't say calmly, but I believe this reads pretty calmly. He just lays out the facts. He's like, I didn't stir up anybody, but this is who I really am. I worship the God of the way, which is the God of our fathers, and I believe everything that was written in the law and by the prophets. Well, he didn't go into details. Remember, this guy he doesn't care about the religious side of it. He cares about why is there problems going on that the Romans have to get involved in. So Paul very eloquently says, listen, I obey all the law, and all the law that was written by all the prophets. He's making it very clear, I don't violate any of this stuff that they're saying I've done. But if he was to go into details, maybe in my mind, I see Felix going, I don't care, dude. Like, I don't even know what you're talking about. So he was and the way he did this was just so wise. Because he's like, listen, I obey all the laws, and I listen to all the prophets. And so that really shuts down their argument that he was violating the law and that he was causing problems in the temple. Anybody else on those first, or those 4 or 5?
No, just that the Jews knew, and he said that, I worship the God of my fathers. Same thing that they do.
Right.
Everything you're saying is exactly what they do, so he just kind of reiterating that to them.
Right, and he didn't say Jesus here.
Right.
Any other time we see this, and you got to catch this,
Yeah, that's right.
knowing your audience, right? When he was in the temple, he's like, yo, this Jesus who you crucified, right? Like, he says it plain as day. He knows his audience here, and what he's being accused of is not obeying the law that the prophets wrote. And he's like, no, the prophets talked about the Messiah. Of course I believe that. And so he knew his audience, bringing up Jesus, because remember, Romans have a hand in obviously crucifying Jesus. So bringing that up, I believe, could have done more damage for him. Not that he was hiding, because he does worship the God of the fathers.
Right.
But he was just knowing your audience, knowing how to say things. And, I tell my son recently, I was like, yo, you got to learn how to read a room. Like, when you walk into a room and there's things going on, you've got to pay attention to what's going on and read people's body language. And I believe Paul was very well versed in this, because we see in how he responds to people. He had a way of responding in a way that kind of disarmed them. And maybe I'm wrong. Maybe that's not how this was. And it was very, animated. I don't get that feel when I read this. I feel like he was just kind of like, listen, this is what it is. This is what it's not. And this is what I confess to you. Okay, let's move on. Like, that's the kind of feel I get from Paul. He was very calm, and it could be because God showed up to him in a dream not too long ago, or spoke to him and said, hey, you're going to have to do this again. So you're going to be all right.
It's already read that. Yeah.
And that, think about it. If you have that hope or that peace about you, you can sit in this type of situation and not react or freak out. Like, if I've had people ask me, are you ever going to move back to Florida? And there's not, I know what I know. I know I'm supposed to be here. And so for me, that's like, when they bring that up, I'm just like, yeah, no. There's not even let me think about that. There's just not. And I think Paul's like, listen, I'm not going to die. So I'm going to be smart. It doesn't mean you should be ignorant, because you need to be very careful. The Bible says be wise. So he's like, I'm not going to stir the pot for no reason. I'm going to respond, but I know that God's got this and I'm okay. And I feel like you can almost feel that in his response, and he just had kind of peace about it all. All right, so I'm going to read 15 through 21. It's a good amount.
And have hope towards God, which they themselves also allow, that there shall be a resurrection of the dead, both the just and the unjust. And herein do I exercise myself to have always a conscience void of offense towards God and towards man. Now that after many years I come to bring alms to my nation and offerings, whereupon certain Jews from Asia found me purified in the temple, neither with multitude nor with from it, who ought to have been here before thee, and object if they had aught against me. Or else let the same here say, if they have found any evil doing in me, why stand before the council? Except it be for this one voice that I cried standing among them, touching the resurrection of the dead, I am called in question by you this day.
What version are you reading from? King James.
So ESV, and I'll read some of the ESV just again, because I think
You're going to ESV?
that's what I always use.
Yeah.
When I teach, I
That's
try to
what you have, right? I have NIV, but it's very similar to ESV.
Yeah. I personally, so when I preach right now, I use the New King James. When I study, I use ESV. And the only reason, not the only reason, I find it easy to read. I'm not that smart to read KJV. But also ESV seems to have the, when you're translating from Greek to Hebrew, it's the most accurate, they say, from the Greek to Hebrew. That's what I have studied out and found. And so for me, that's what I use. I think anything you read in the Bible is amazing. I think you have to be careful. And I actually, right now I have I have a couple different Bibles up on my screen, and I will do that when I study. But for the most part, I do use ESV, and sometimes it takes out the vowels and the wilts and the words that I don't know what they mean. It helps me with that. So, So he's talking about having a hope with God, and he says with these men, except. So he's like, listen, basically, we agree on everything, except for there'll be a resurrection of both the just and unjust. And this is what he talked about when he was, last week, when he had the split with the Pharisees and the Sadducees. He's remembered that one believed there was resurrection of the dead and one did not. So he's saying we both have a hope, and he's like, this is what it is. This is the difference. He said, I always take pains to have a clear conscience towards God and man. He's like, I try not to offend. If I can just put this in plain English, I try to remain blameless. I try not to create offenses. I try not to hurt people's feelings with what I say. And he did. I mean, Paul said some pretty straightforward words, but he said it in love, and you can always see that. And then he said, after several years, I came to bring alms to my nation and present offerings. Again, wise. Okay, now whether, we've talked about this a couple of chapters ago, that they prepared to go to the temple and they brought offerings and they were going to sacrifice. Well, man, hindsight's 20/20. You look back and you realize the importance of him purifying himself, the importance of him bringing offerings to them, of doing all of these things, because guess what? It lines up with what they do all the time. So it's really hard to say, you did this wrong, when he came and he respected their culture. He respected what they did without violating what he believed. It's important, right? It's like if you go into somebody's house who sits down on the floor and eats, and you're trying to witness to them, and you're like, yo, give me a chair. You're done. You might as well just pack your bag, walk out the door. You are never going to convince them that the love of Jesus is inside of you if you can't respect their culture. Now, if their culture says you need to go do this, and it's a violation of what you believe, then there is a place where you say, hey, I appreciate the offer, that's something I can't do. And if they're passing around a peace pipe, probably should not participate in it. Just going to go with that's probably not a good thing to do. Like, that's a violation, right? We want to be sober-minded, and I obviously I joke, but seriously, if you've ever been in situations where, I've been in people's houses where, we're talking about God and, they're drinking. Okay, do you, boo-boo. It does not impact me in the least bit, and I'm not going to say, put that beer, that's just, why would I do that? Now, if they offered me a beer, I would kindly say, hey, I appreciate it, I'm drinking, thank you. Like, that's just it. And so, I think that's what Paul's saying here. He's like, listen, I do my best not to offend people, and God. And that's where you've got that balance of, if it violates God's law, it doesn't matter who's telling you to do it, don't do it. And he says that. And of course he talks about the Jews from Asia. And he says, if I can again use Michael's, where are they at? He said, they ought to be here. And they're not. These are the dudes who caused all, it's amazing to me. It's amazing to me how people who stir the pot and want to make so many problems, and we read this through the Bible, when it all comes to light, they ain't there. They got everything else all twisted up, and they got all this stuff going on, and here's Paul facing accusers, and those dudes don't even have enough guts to be there to say, yo, I'm the one that started this. They're not even there. And I found that, I was like, huh. It's like, that's a lesson. Put that in the back of my head.
They were afraid of the Roman, like they had power, or they were, but going in somewhere else, they didn't have that power no more, so they were like, okay.
Well, this is Michael, verse 1 and 1. Based off reading this, what I feel is they would have been exposed. They would have been exposed as they're the ones who caused the riots. They would have been exposed as they were the ones who did this. And the Romans would have said, hold up. You're not the one who caused the riots. You are, arrest them and put them in jail. Because they would have been
killed.
Or killed, whatever would have happened. Because they would have
had no proof because he was innocent.
That's right, but they have proof that they caused the riots. And I think they would have been exposed for, because if we really read what they did, again, this is how my brain sees what they did, and you guys, we can have difference of opinions on all this because this is not necessarily Bible, this is how my brain sees it. I see crowds and I see people walking behind people. Yo, can you believe what Paul did? Yo, can you believe what Paul did? That's what I see happening in this crowd. That these people are whispering from ear to ear, and they are literally tickled. That's what the Bible talks about. Be careful about wanting your ear tickled. You want truth. Because it's real simple when somebody comes up behind you, and you're like, yo, who said that? I don't, that's what I feel like. And maybe I'm wrong, but this crowd, that's how the impression I've gotten every time that we've interacted with them in the Bible is they make this huge issue, and then they're like in the back, and they're like, oh, we got them. And they're not even there. You're like, and then we see that here.
They hired a lawyer, so they didn't really have to be there.
Well, Ananias hired a lawyer. Right, so that was the high priest, which he did obviously. Now, he did disrespect the high priest, he said he didn't know, we talked about that last one. But as far as the Jews from Asia, the way Paul says, he says they ought to be here before you make accusations. So whether, to your point, whether they were part of that hiring process or it was just the high priest that hired, to your point, it could be either one. But the high priest still showed up,
Right.
and there were some Jews there. But the Jews, Paul makes it clear that none of the ones from Asia were there. So for whatever reason, they were not. Again, Michael verse 1 just feels like, oh, we're going to be in a place where we can't hide in the shadows. And you find that people that want to cause riots like to hide in the shadows. We see that all the time. That's nothing new under the sun.
Right.
When you're like, you can go under fire.
Well, right, because remember, this guy had like this guy Felix had a lot of power. And so if he found Paul guilty, Paul's dead, right? And if he turned around and found another issue, you know, I still want to know what happened to the dudes that took a 40-day fast.
Right.
We're 7 days in at this point. I want to know how you hang him.
Oh, yeah.
Because you didn't drink. It said no drink, no food. So I want to know, are you still alive? Because it's 7 days, and I don't know the body yet. I haven't, from what I can tell, I think the longest somebody's gone is like 4 or 5 days without
Or if
water.
they just were like suicide.
They're either going to lose face or they're going to be in the grave. It's kind of like they don't have another choice in the matter at this point. 7 days in, they would have had to make a
I
decision.
feel like they wouldn't have starved themselves. I feel like they would have took a quicker route, like
Well, I think they would have said he's in jail and that we've done our job and we can't touch him. I mean, maybe I feel like they would have taken the count away.
I really think it's going to a higher court,
Sure.
higher court. Obviously, they're not going to be able to sneak in there again.
But they took a vow, right? So they're violating. So like I said, they're going to either have to like step away and, you know.
Or they said, oh great, we got him in prison, we completed our vow because, you know, he's in sentence for life now, we're good to go.
I think it's, I mean, like I said, I read through 24 and 25, and obviously they don't mention it. I can't find an answer as to what really happened. It's one of those things that'll probably just sit there.
Oh, about in the last chapter of those 4.
Yeah, when I go to heaven, I'll be like, yo, what happened to those cats? I want to know. Just because, like, I mean, that was a pretty bold, like, again, words have power. You know, if you've had, I've had to back down words, and that stinks, man. You make a statement, and you're like, oh, I shouldn't have said that. And they made a vow. They either had to back that down, which in their culture would have been, I mean, that would have been a pretty bad deal, or I would imagine they're dead at this point. I would think 7 days with no water, no drink.
I never even read anything more about that in the Bible.
Yeah, I have never either. So
They were
They
bored.
probably don't know what we're talking about. We're talking about something that happened in the last chapter. There was 40 men that they're like, we're not eating or drinking anything until
till we kill Paul.
we kill Paul.
And so then Paul was put into this jail, and it tells us like
And now
7
he's
days, at least 7 days have passed. It could be more like 8 or 9. But
Right.
it's 7 days since he got there, which we don't know what the journey really was, but a minimum of 7 days has happened, and they're not supposed to drink or eat. I'm gonna go with they're shriveled up dead. That's just me,
Or they just backed out of it.
right? Which they would lose their voice at that point. Which
Right.
either way, they kind of got silenced. So. All right, and so then I'm sorry. Paul then also says, "Or also let these men say what wrongdoings they found when I stood before the council." So now he's saying, okay, the dudes from Asia that caused all this grief, they ain't here. These dudes really haven't said I've done anything wrong, so if I've done, tell me what I've done. And then he says, other than that, this one thing that I cried out while standing among them, from what I can tell, he's referring to when he went after the high priest. When he called, when he said, what did he say? When the high priest told him, when the high priest told him to punch Paul in the mouth, and he responded,
Yeah, last chapter.
yeah, I can't remember exactly what he said, but that's what I gather what he's talking about. He's like, so he's owning it. He's like, I made a mistake. Whether it was intentional or non-intentional, the Bible kind of leaves it up for our own interpretation.
Right.
I kind of feel like Paul was like, yeah, you don't really act like a high priest, so I'm going to call you out, but that's just my opinion on it. And then he says, it's respect to the resurrection of the dead that I'm on trial before you today. So again, he goes back to the heart of the issue when he split the council last week. He said, the reason I'm here is because I believe that there's resurrection power. That's it. And again, Paul, he doesn't waste words. He just kind of speaks it, and he kind of just goes like, checkbox, check, 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 check. Okay, moving on. Like he just kind of addresses what's going on. Anybody have I know that was a lot to add into that. All right. So then somebody can finish this out, 22 through 27.
Then Felix, who was well acquainted with the way, adjourned the proceedings. When Lysias the commander comes, he said, I will decide your case. He ordered the centurion to keep Paul under guard, but to give him some freedom and permit his friends to take care of his needs. Several days later, Felix came with his wife Drusilla, who was Jewish. He sent for Paul and listened to him as he spoke about faith in Christ Jesus. As Paul talked about righteousness, self-control, and the judgment to come, Felix was afraid and said, That's enough for now, you may leave. When I find it convenient, I will send for you. At the same time, he was hoping that Paul would offer him a bribe, so he sent for him frequently and talked to him. When 2 years had passed, Felix was succeeded by Porcius Festus, but because Felix wanted to grant a favor to the Jews, he left Paul in prison.
So, kind of interesting. So now we find out Felix is rather having a rather accurate knowledge of the way is the way the ESV says it. So again, plain terms, he knew who the way was. Did Paul know this? We don't really have that context. So I kind of feel like that's kind of one of the reasons Paul didn't like go into all this, because he's like, you already kind of know. Again, I feel like the Romans would have kept track of that. They crucified Jesus. Jesus resurrected from the dead. There was a following. If I was in charge of that town, I would be keeping an eye. Like, yo, you need to keep an eye on those dudes, because the dead people rise up when they're around. There's a problem with them. We need to keep an eye. And we see that with the disciples, there's been dead raised. So when they're in town and when they're praying for people, something happens. If I was the law in town, I would know. If I was a law in town of a Pentecostal church and I saw miracles happening there or hearing about them, I would keep an eye. I mean, that's your job, to keep an eye on things. Hey, there's something a little different about that church, because people go in wheelchairs and come out healed. Can you imagine Azusa Street? People wanted to know what's going on. The law was very much aware. If you read what happened there, and those of you who don't know, Azusa Street was what they believe the start of the revival in America, and it happened in 1902, Dad? Or 1904?
It started here first, in Murphy. The sheer schoolhouses happened before this Azusa Street.
Yeah, but Azusa Street was like because even in Topeka, Kansas, which was before that, but it was the great earthquake. I think it was 1913. It was whenever the great earthquake happened in California. It was that same time. Anyways, huge revival happened there. It was crazy. People would come in. I think it was before. I think so. People would come from. They'd be blocks away, and if they got out of their car, the conviction of the Holy Ghost, they'd get the Holy Ghost 2 blocks from the house. They couldn't even get there. They said there was like a cloud. It was amazing. I promised you, the cops knew and kept an eye on that place. And they're like, yo, it was like, we're going to stand back here, and we're not going, and people wouldn't, unless they wanted to be touched by God, they stayed away. And so I feel, again, the Romans knew this, because everywhere the disciples went, signs and wonders followed. So he knew this. And so he's like, again, same thing we saw when they crucified Jesus. Nobody wants to take responsibility for what's going on. The centurion sends them to Felix. Felix is like, yo, when the tribune comes down, I'll decide your case. We'll talk about it with somebody else. It's this, I don't want to get my hands dirty, because you have to understand there was this very delicate balance between keeping the Jewish Sadducees and Pharisees happy and also keeping power in the Roman hands. And that balance was constantly like this. And so, same thing when they crucified Jesus. They were really trying to figure out how to be blameless in a situation that they were being forced into, making a decision that was really, Jesus didn't break any laws. It was really, really a religious thing. And it's the same concept that happened. And he says, I thought it was funny, he's like, give him some liberties. Let his friends come take care of him. I was like, Paul was like, This part was interesting. So his wife actually, she was with somebody else and left him to marry Felix.
Right.
So you have to kind of catch this. So maybe Paul shouldn't have told us. I don't know. But Paul spoke, and it convicted the dude. He was like, again, Michael's word. he's like, I'm living in sin, and I'm going to hell, thanks a lot, man, right? Like, Paul, I have a feeling Paul told him that, right? Just like, Paul just told him the truth, like, hey, man, this is what's going on. And I'm sure that did not sit very well with him, and he became alarmed.
Didn't it say she was Jewish though?
Yes.
Yes,
So she already had, like, according to the Jewish law, that was already, not just according to the way, but according to her.
So Drulis was one of the youngest daughters.
So is there,
It'd be
Yeah,
cool.
so so according to, again, I did not go deep into this, but from what I read from a biblical encyclopedia about her, he used Simon the sorcerer. You see that dude come back around?
Oh, yeah.
He sent Simon the sorcerer to this woman to convince her to leave her current husband
Oh my.
to come with her. It was pretty twisted. So yeah, so she
oh, so
knew.
he comes back.
So yeah, so Felix liked this woman so much, he fell in love with her. He hired Simon the
So
sorcerer.
maybe is that how he knew about the way? Because Simon the
Well,
sorcerer was from
yeah, because Simon. So you see, like this whole.
twisted.
Did they
Twisted.
pull that from like Josephus or something?
Yeah, that's what this says according to that. This is the Lexham Bible Dictionary. So again, this is one source. I want to be very clear. I did not go into deep study. Lexham is pretty accurate. I haven't
Yeah.
found anything that's too crazy in it. It's more of a historical base.
They're conservative.
Yeah, absolutely. But I just want to be clear, I did not go in-depth study with it. That's what I found at a very surface level. And they said that they believe it was Simon the sorcerer. He went to convince her to leave her husband. She left and then married him, and they had one son named Agrippa. So anyways, so obviously this woman knows what she's already done is wrong. Now Paul's telling them, so he sends them away. When you really start reading this or start researching it, it was very common for prisoners to pay bribes to Felix, so that way this would happen. So he kept calling Paul in, not because he wanted to hear more of Paul tell him he was going to hell, but because he wanted him to pay him his money, just so we're clear. So it said he brought him in frequently, but it wasn't because he wanted to hear him tell, the truth or speak to him. He wanted to convince him to start offering him bribes. And funny thing, guess what? He's removed from power, and he was succeeded by Porcius Festus. Sad thing, Paul's here 2 years.
Yeah.
Is that the same that Joseph's? Was it Joseph that spent 2 years? Or is it?
Joseph was in
Like
prison
15 years or something.
Yeah, I'd have to go back. I don't remember how long. He was in for a while. But it may have been 2 years from when he did the dreams to when he was out. I think that may be where you're at. I think. I'd have to double check the time. But, so he was in for 2 years.
That's a long
For
time.
what? Waiting trial. Actually, wait, he already had a trial. So for 2 years, this guy Felix wouldn't.
Had the trial, just no
It's
decision
no
was made.
fun,
Yeah.
man.
So for 2 years, he never gave him.
Done it, was it you did it for 2 years?
No, I was in for 11 months.
I read 22, I remember.
Yeah, absolutely.
It says, and when Felix heard these things, having more perfect knowledge of that way, he deferred them and said, when Lucas, the chief captain, shall come down, I will know the utmost part in your matter. So Felix knew everything about the way already.
Mhm.
That's why when he's hearing this stuff, he's like, oh my God. Paul's telling him this is what's really going on. So he wasn't ignorant of the way.
Nope.
He knew what was going on.
Absolutely. Yep, and that's yes, to your point, absolutely. But again, he won't make a decision. I find that really funny. And again, but Paul's stuck in jail for 2 years. I'm kind of curious what did Paul do for 2 years? We'll probably find that out as we read on, but we're not going to go into 25 tonight. I didn't think we were going to.
Convert all the prisoners.
But yeah, imagine. So like, again, you've been falsely accused. You've already pled your case one place. It got violent. They removed you, put you here. You pledged your case again. Your accusers don't even really show up, or all of them don't even show up. The ones that have supposed evidence. And then, well, we want you to bribe us, and well, you can stay in jail for 2 years. Like, I would not be very happy. Poor Paul. Like, so for 2 years he sits there, and then this new guy comes in, which is Porcius Festus, which was
Festus.
yes, and he's a governor. So, and we'll read more of that. So, and Felix, again, it says, in desiring to do the Jewish a favor, Felix left Paul in prison. This goes back to that balance again. He was like, I want them to be happy, so I'm going to put them in prison. So,
I know, but earlier it talks about how even though he puts him in jail, he's like, let his friends hang out with him. It was a pretty light sentence. I wonder if it remained that for the whole 2 years.
Yeah, if it was still comfortable, or if it was.
well, he said he sent for him often and conversed with him, but when you study it out, what it says is, apparently, this is what it says, so apparently bribes are so common in cases such as Paul's that Felix expected it. The bribe Felix expected might have been to ensure Paul received a hearing, not necessarily to free him. So what it's kind of alluding to the fact is, he did not let him have a trial because he didn't bribe him. So he was like, it wasn't that they were going to free him, he's like, you want a speedy trial? Pay up some money. And because Paul didn't bribe him, that's what, again, this is
Yeah.
one commentary, but that's what they believe that happened. So I think that maybe why God allowed for Felix to be removed, because he said, you're just going to sit here and, you want to bribe to move the court forward. I guess there was no speedy trials back then.
Well, it probably is true. I mean, I'm saying that, at the same time, it says, at the same time, he hoped that money would be given him by Paul. So he sent for him often. So he clearly was hoping for a bribe.
So he's like, yo, do you want to have a trial this week? I mean, that's probably, can you imagine? And then, Paul obviously does not pay him.
You think you would get tired of hearing Paul say the same things over though? Like, he's like, which one do you want more, bribe or the gospel conviction?
Listen, there's people that come to church all the time that it feels good to hear the word of God, and they go back on Monday and they live the same life Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, and they come back Sunday after Sunday and Sunday and don't change.
Yeah.
Because it feels good to hear to be around people who are living the life and have the presence of God living in their life. And they're like, well, that feels good. So maybe when Paul came, it's kind of like the whole David and Saul thing. David played, Saul was, peace.
Yeah.
Sends him away, goes back to living his nasty life. When he's starting to get overwhelmed, he calls Paul back to speak. It doesn't tell us that, but I believe that Paul has the anointing. And I believe that when you have the anointing, you bring peace with you. And so, I've shared this from the pulpit. There was people in my life that when I was not living right, I could go to my mom's house, Mom and Jay's house, and go to your guys' house, and there was peace. And I was like, oh, I'm not tormented Mom here. This is great. And be fine for a couple hours, feel great, get all the weight lifted off me, and then go right back and get high and drunk and live in promiscuous, all of those things, because I didn't want to change. I just wanted to feel better for a little bit. And so I think that happens all the time. So whether that was what Felix was doing or not, you don't know, but he knew about the way, so I imagine he knew they had power through the Holy Ghost, all those things. So, people like surrounding themselves by power. I think we can prove that. He had Simon the sorcerer, obviously around enough that he could use him, so I would imagine, this guy liked power.